I moved into the town on a foggy morning in early autumn, thinking I had finally found the peace I'd been looking for after years of working in noisy, crowded cities. The road into town was lined with tall maples whose leaves had just begun to turn, painting the air with drifting reds and golds. It looked like something from a postcard, quiet, calm, maybe even a little too still. My car rumbled past an old wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Elmbrook, founded 1823. The paint was chipped, the wood splintered, and someone had scratched something into the surface beneath the letters, but it was too faded for me to read. My new place was an old rental house on the edge of town, the kind with a wide porch and creaky floorboards that probably had 100 years' worth of stories embedded in the wood. The landlord, Mr. Harris, was waiting for me when I pulled up. He was in his 60s, tall and thin, with a worn-out flannel shirt and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His handshake was firm, but he didn't smile. "You're the new tenant," he said, not so much asking as stating. I nodded and he handed me the keys without ceremony. Then he did something strange. He gave me a folded piece of paper and said, "Read this before sundown, and don't ignore it." I unfolded it right there on the porch. It was a list, not house rules, but rules for the town. 11 of them handwritten in neat block letters. The first few were harmless enough. Lock all doors and windows before dark. Never leave trash outside overnight. If you hear knocking at your door after midnight, do not answer. But the further I read, the stranger they got. Rule 6 said, if you see a man in a brown hat standing at the end of your driveway, turn off all lights and stay away from the windows. Rule 9 said, on the last Friday of each month, be indoors by 8:00 p.m., no exceptions. And the last one, Rule 11, simply read, if someone offers to show you the orchard, say no. I looked up at Mr. Harris, half expecting him to smirk or tell me it was some kind of local joke, but his face stayed completely serious. You follow them, you'll be fine, he said. People who don't last long here. With that, he tipped his cap, got into his truck, and drove off. I told myself it was just small-town superstition, the kind of thing people tell newcomers to make them feel uneasy. Still, I kept the list in my pocket. The day passed quietly. I unpacked, made coffee, and explored the backyard. The house backed up to a line of woods that stretched out further than I could see, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and something sweet like overripe fruit. Around 6:30, the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the porch. I remembered the first rule and went around locking all the doors and windows. It felt silly, but I did it anyway. By 8:00, the town outside was completely silent. No cars, no voices, not even the sound of crickets. I sat in the living room with a book, trying not to think about the rules. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it, 3 slow knocks on the front door. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, book halfway open in my lap. The knocks came again, exactly the same as before. Slow, steady, deliberate. I glanced toward the door but couldn't see anything through the narrow window beside it. My first thought was maybe a neighbor needed help. My second thought was the third rule: if you hear knocking at your door after midnight, do not answer. I stayed where I was, holding my breath. After a long moment, the knock stopped. I waited, ears straining in the silence. Then I heard footsteps on the porch, soft, dragging footsteps moving away from the door. I should have felt relieved, but when I finally looked out the window, the street was empty. No one there. I went back to the couch, but I didn't sleep that night. And the whole time, I kept thinking about something Mr. Harris had said. People who don't follow the rules don't last long here. The next morning I told myself it had all been in my head, some branch tapping against the siding or the house settling in the cold night air. Still, I kept glancing at the front door while I made coffee, half expecting to see muddy footprints on the porch. There were none. I walked into town to get a feel for the place. Elmbrook was small, just 2 streets that crossed in the center, with a diner, a hardware store, a post office, and a handful of other shops. People looked up when I passed, most offering a nod or a polite morning, but their eyes lingered a little too long, like they were measuring me. At the diner, I took a seat by the window. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Carol, smiled as she poured my coffee. "You're the new one renting Harris's place," she said. Not a question, I nodded. "How's your first night?" she asked, her voice casual but her gaze sharp. "Quiet," I said. She gave a small smile but didn't push. When she came back with my breakfast, she leaned in slightly. "You keep that list?" I nodded again. "Good, don't lose it." Then she straightened and walked away before I could ask anything. That evening, as I unpacked more boxes, I remembered Rule 9. On the last Friday of each month, be indoors by 8:00 p.m. No exceptions. I pulled out my phone and checked the date. It was the last Friday of the month. Something in my stomach tightened. I locked all the doors and windows early, drew the curtains, and made dinner. The sun dipped, and the air outside seemed to grow heavier, pressing against the walls. At 7:45, the street outside was already empty. At 8:00 sharp, every light in the neighboring houses went out. I hesitated, then turned off all mine too, leaving only a dim lamp in the kitchen. The silence was deeper than the night before, no cars, no wind, just an oppressive stillness. I tried to distract myself with a book, but I kept glancing at the clock. At 8:37 I heard something, not knocking this time, singing. A low, slow tune drifting in from somewhere down the street. The voice was male, deep and steady, humming a melody I didn't recognize. It grew closer. My chest tightened. Against my better judgment, I moved to the window and carefully lifted the corner of the curtain. A man walked slowly down the middle of the street. He was tall, wearing a brown hat pulled low, his hands tucked into the pockets of a long coat. His head swayed slightly as he walked, keeping time with the song. Rule 6 flashed in my mind. If you see a man in a brown hat standing at the end of your driveway, turn off all lights and stay away from the windows. He wasn't at my driveway yet, but he was coming closer. I let the curtain fall back and crouched low, heart pounding in my ears. The singing grew louder, filling the street, seeping through the walls. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but at some point the sound stopped. I waited in the heavy silence, every muscle tense. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching up the gravel of my driveway. I didn't move. The footsteps stopped just short of the porch. I could feel him there on the other side of the door, standing in the dark. A minute passed, 2. Then, as if deciding something, he walked away. The gravel crunched again, then faded. I didn't dare look until I heard the distant hum of his song growing fainter, disappearing into the night. I stayed up until dawn, every light off, the list of rules clutched in my hand. When morning came, I opened the front door. There were no footprints, no sign anyone had been there at all, but I knew what I'd heard. And I knew this: the rules weren't just old stories. They were warnings, and I had no idea how many more I'd have to survive. 2 days after that night, I decided to drive out past the town limits just to see what was around. Elmbrook was surrounded by woods, thick and dark, the kind that swallowed the light even during the day. The road narrowed until it was just a strip of cracked asphalt with weeds pushing up through the edges. I drove for 10 minutes before I noticed the figure up ahead. He was standing right at the edge of the tree line, half in shadow, half in the pale morning sun. Even from a distance, I could tell it was the same man from that Friday night, the brown hat, the long coat. He wasn't moving, just watching the road. My hands tightened on the wheel. Rule 4 came to mind: do not speak to strangers who seem to know your name. I told myself he wouldn't know me. But as I slowed to pass, he lifted his head slightly, and I swear his mouth moved. I couldn't hear what he said, but it felt like the sound went straight into my bones. My foot pressed harder on the gas, and I didn't look back. By the time I reached the next curve, he was gone from the mirror. That evening at the diner, I told Carol what I'd seen. She froze mid-pour, then set the coffee pot down. "You don't go past the bend on County Road after sunrise," she said, her voice low. "Not alone." When I asked why, she just shook her head and muttered, "Some rules aren't written down." I drove home with that gnawing at me. If there were rules that weren't even on the paper, how was I supposed to know them? That night, I made sure the curtains were drawn tight. At 11:15, I was in bed when I heard a single knock on the back door. I froze. Another knock, slower this time. I slid out of bed, careful not to make the floorboards creak, and made my way to the kitchen. Through the thin gap between the curtains, I saw him, the man in the brown hat, standing just beyond the porch light's reach, his head tilted toward the door as if he could see me. Rule 6 didn't mention the back door. My mind spun. Was this some kind of test? I backed away slowly, step by step, until I was back in the hallway. The knocking stopped. I waited in silence for what felt like an hour, but I couldn't bring myself to check again. In the morning, the back porch was empty, but on the wooden step sat a small object, a smooth, round stone painted entirely black. No note, no explanation. I didn't touch it. I just shut the door and locked it, my hands shaking. That was the first time I realized the rules weren't just about surviving random nights. Someone, or something, was paying attention to me, watching how I reacted. And I had a sinking feeling that failing a rule wasn't the only way to lose. It was the following Saturday when I learned what the locals meant by "some rules aren't written down." The day had been quiet, too quiet. Around 8:45 p.m., as I sat in the living room reading, the sound of footsteps drifted in from outside. Not just one set, dozens, maybe more, moving in perfect unison. My first thought was that it was some kind of town event, but there hadn't been any flyers or announcements. The rules didn't say anything about parades. Still, something in my gut told me not to open the door. The sound grew louder, a slow, steady cadence, as if an unseen march was passing right down my street. I crept to the window, pulled the curtain back a sliver, and my breath caught in my throat. There, moving through the dimly lit street, was a line of people. At least they looked like people. Each one wore a black coat that reached the ground, their faces hidden under wide-brimmed hats. They walked in pairs, every step perfectly synchronized. No one spoke. No one looked around. The air felt heavy, like the whole night was holding its breath. I counted 20, maybe 25 of them before I realized something. Their feet weren't quite touching the pavement, they glided. My stomach turned cold. Then one of them stopped. Slowly, its head tilted toward my window. I stumbled backward, the curtain falling shut. My heart pounded in my ears. I remembered the feeling from that first night that if they knew you were watching, something bad would happen. The footsteps outside stopped, all of them. The silence was worse than the sound. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Minutes passed before the steps started again, as if on some signal. I stayed frozen until the last sound faded into the distance. The next morning, I stepped outside to find a folded piece of paper wedged between my door and the frame. It wasn't in the same handwriting as the original rules. This one said only, "You were seen. Next time, don't look." There was no signature, no explanation. I looked down the street, but the road was empty. Only the faint outline of strange, long marks dragged across the pavement told me it had really happened. I shut the door and locked it, telling myself over and over that I'd follow the rules, written or not. But deep down, I knew I'd already broken one. The week after the silent parade, the air in Elmbrook felt different, heavier. I found myself glancing at shadows more than usual, locking my doors twice, drawing curtains before sunset. It was around midnight on a Wednesday when I woke to a soft, deliberate knock at the front door, 3 taps evenly spaced. I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, telling myself it was just the wind or a branch against the wood. But then it came again. 3 taps, pause, 3 more. I remembered Rule 2, do not answer the door after 11:30 p.m., no matter what you hear. My first instinct was to stay in bed, but curiosity clawed at me. Slowly, I crept down the hallway, my bare feet silent against the floor. I stopped just short of the door, holding my breath. The knocking stopped. I exhaled. Then from the other side, a voice, low, calm, almost polite, said my name. Not a shout, not a question, just my name. My stomach dropped. Rule 4 flashed in my mind. Do not speak to strangers who seem to know your name. I backed away, 1 step at a time, keeping my eyes fixed on the door. The voice spoke again, this time a little louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from the crack under the door, but from somewhere higher. Like the speaker was leaning close to the peephole. I didn't dare look. I turned to leave the hallway when the knocking started again, faster this time, harder, as if whoever was out there was losing patience. I reached the bedroom, shut the door, and pressed my back against it. The knocks became pounding. My walls seemed to tremble. Then suddenly silence. I waited, 1 minute, 2. The quiet stretched on until I started to believe it was over. That's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound at the bedroom window. My head turned slowly toward the noise. There, through the thin gap in the curtains, I saw the outline of a face. No details, just a pale oval where a face should be, motionless. I didn't move. Neither did it. We stayed like that for what felt like hours until, without warning, the shape slipped out of view. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting on the edge of my bed with a baseball bat in hand, waiting for something to happen. When morning finally came, I walked to the window. The grass outside was wet with dew, except for a single set of footprints leading from the porch to the window, and then continuing straight toward the woods. The prints didn't fade. They just stopped, as if the person had vanished mid-step. By Friday, I convinced myself the knocks at my door and the face in the window were isolated incidents. Maybe my imagination was just running wild after weeks of trying to decode this town's bizarre rules. That afternoon, I decided to go to the only grocery store in Elmbrook. It was small, the kind of place where the produce section was just 2 bins of apples and a few sad heads of lettuce. I was halfway down the canned goods aisle when I noticed a man standing at the far end. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about him, mid-40s, faded jeans, a plaid shirt, but he wasn't moving. He was staring right at me. The moment our eyes met, he smiled. Not a friendly smile, but something tight, deliberate. My skin prickled. I turned back to the shelves, pretending to read the label on a can of soup. When I glanced back, he was closer. Same smile, same unblinking stare. I remembered Rule 6 from the sheet. If someone you don't recognize smiles at you without blinking, leave immediately. My heart sped up. I tried to act casual, pushing my cart toward the checkout, but as I turned the corner into the next aisle, he was already there, blocking the way. His head tilted slightly, eyes locked on mine. "You're new here," he said softly, almost like a statement of fact. I didn't answer. I just backed away, turning toward the freezer section, but every time I moved, he seemed to anticipate it, appearing in the next aisle before I could get there. My breathing quickened. The store was oddly quiet, no cashier's chatter, no background music, not even the hum of the refrigerators. It was like the two of us were the only ones inside. I abandoned my cart and headed for the exit, walking fast but not running. Running felt like it would make things worse. The automatic doors slid open and I stepped out into the parking lot. Relief washed over me until I realized the lot was completely empty. My car was the only one there. I hurried to it, fumbling with my keys. That's when I saw him again, standing inside the store just beyond the glass doors, still smiling, still staring, and not blinking. I got into the car and locked the doors. My hands shook as I started the engine. Through the windshield, I could see him raise one hand and point directly at me. Then, slowly, he drew his thumb across his throat. My tires squealed as I pulled out of the lot, not daring to look back. By the time I reached my house, my chest was tight with panic. I locked the door and checked every window twice. Later that night, when I finally worked up the courage to look outside, I spotted a small piece of folded paper tucked under the wiper blade of my car. I opened it with trembling hands. 4 words, written in neat block letters. "You broke another rule." The note under my wiper didn't leave my mind for days. You broke another rule. I couldn't figure out which one they meant. I hadn't spoken to the man in the store. I hadn't answered the door that night. But maybe in Elmbrook, breaking a rule didn't require doing something. Maybe it was enough to notice something you weren't supposed to. On Sunday morning, the town felt unnaturally still. The church bells rang at 8:00 a.m., low and slow, the sound rolling through the streets like fog. I stepped outside just to breathe some fresh air, and that's when I saw them. A line of people walking down Main Street, all dressed in black. They moved in perfect silence, their heads bowed, their steps in sync. There was no priest, no casket, nothing to carry, just the slow march of figures in mourning. And then I realized something that made my stomach turn. Every single one of them was wearing a black veil, even the men. The fabric covered their faces completely. I couldn't see eyes, noses, mouths, nothing. Just outlines of heads under the thin, swaying cloth. I froze by my porch, watching as they passed. Some part of me wanted to go inside, shut the door, pretend I hadn't seen it, but I couldn't. I was rooted there, drawn to the strangeness. They didn't glance at me as they went by, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. When the last one passed, I thought it was over, but then the entire group stopped in unison. My throat tightened. Slowly, in perfect synchronization, they turned their veiled heads toward me. I couldn't see their faces, but I felt their gaze, a heavy, pressing weight, like they were studying me. My hands started to sweat. I remembered something from the bottom of the rule sheet. If you see the funeral, bow your head and close your eyes until the last bell stops ringing. I hadn't done that. I took a step back toward my front door, heart hammering. The tallest figure in the group took a step forward. I could hear the faint whisper of fabric brushing against itself. Then the church bell tolled again, one final, long note that seemed to stretch on forever. When it stopped, the entire group turned away and resumed walking, disappearing down the street. My knees nearly gave out. I stumbled inside and locked the door. For the rest of the day, I kept the curtains closed. But late that night, when I peeked outside, I saw a black veil folded neatly on my front porch. I stood at the doorway for a long time before I even dared to reach for it. The veil lay there like it had been waiting for me, perfectly folded, the kind of careful fold that told me someone had taken their time. It wasn't just dropped there, it was placed. The fabric was black, thin, almost see-through if you held it to the light, but something about it felt heavier than it should, like the weight wasn't in the material itself, but in whatever it carried with it. I crouched down, my fingers hovering over it for a second before I finally picked it up. The moment I did, I felt a chill climb up my arm, not like a gust of wind, but like cold water seeping into my skin. It smelled faintly of damp earth and something else I couldn't place at first, something metallic, sharp, almost like blood that had dried a long time ago. I carried it inside, not even sure why I didn't just throw it back into the street. Maybe because part of me felt that once it was on my porch, it was already mine, whether I wanted it or not. I placed it on the kitchen table and just stood there, staring at it like it might start moving on its own. For hours, I tried to go about my day, cooking, reading, anything to keep my mind off it. But every time I passed the table, my eyes went straight to it. By evening, the sun had dipped low and the shadows in the house grew longer, stretching across the floor like fingers. I closed all the curtains, but the unease didn't go away. When night fell, I made sure every door was locked, every light was off except for the lamp in my bedroom. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the silent funeral I had seen that morning. My heart still hadn't shaken off the moment when they all turned toward me in unison. Sometime around midnight, I heard it, a slow, deliberate tapping, not at the front door, at the living room window. I froze, listening, 3 taps, then silence. I forced myself to get up, moving slowly, my bare feet silent on the floor. When I reached the living room, I didn't see anyone outside. The street was empty, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp down the block. But when I looked closer at the glass, my stomach dropped. There were fingerprints, dozens of them, small, faint smudges as if someone, or several someones, had been pressing their hands against the window, leaning close enough to fog the glass. My skin prickled and my throat felt tight. Then the tapping came again, softer this time, almost hesitant. Like whoever was out there wanted me to know they were there, but not anyone else. I backed away, every instinct screaming at me to retreat, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that window. For a moment, I thought about calling Sheriff Cole, but I remembered the look he'd given me when I first arrived in town, that unreadable, measuring stare that made me feel like I'd already done something wrong just by existing here. I didn't trust him. Instead, I retreated to my bedroom, locked the door, and tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Sometime later, I must have fallen asleep because when I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was my bedroom door, and it was unlocked. My chest tightened. I got up, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor, and walked toward the kitchen. The table was empty. The veil was gone. My pulse spiked as I turned toward the front door. It was there, hanging neatly on the inside, draped over the hook where I usually kept my coat, and tucked deep within its folds was a note. The handwriting was the same as before, neat block letters that seemed almost too precise. "You'll need this soon." I didn't touch it again. I left it hanging there, but for the rest of the night and the days that followed, I kept catching myself glancing toward the door, not because I was afraid of someone taking it, but because I was starting to believe that soon someone might come for me to use it. The night it happened, the town was silent in that suffocating way only small places can be. No cars passing, no wind through the trees, not even the sound of an insect. I was sitting in the living room with the lamp turned low, the black veil still hanging by the door like some kind of patient sentinel. I'd been staring at it for so long that the room beyond it started to feel unreal, like I was looking into a photograph instead of my own hallway. Then it came, one single knock. Not a friendly rap, not an urgent pounding, just one deliberate knock. It echoed through the wood like it had all the time in the world. I didn't move at first. I just sat there, waiting to hear it again, but it didn't come. After what felt like minutes, I finally stood, my bare feet making no sound against the floor. I approached the door slowly, each step heavier than the last, my eyes never leaving the shape of that veil swaying faintly against the wall. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I didn't touch it. Instead, I leaned forward and looked through the peephole. At first, I thought no one was there. The porch looked empty under the pale light. But then I saw it, not a person, but a shadow, standing just outside the reach of the light. It was tall and still, and the longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't moving at all. That's when I noticed something else. The street beyond my porch wasn't empty. There were shapes along the sidewalk, more shadows, all facing my house, all utterly still. My skin prickled and my breath caught in my throat. I stepped back from the door slowly, not wanting even the sound of my movement to break whatever this was. And then from somewhere among those still figures, a voice spoke. It was low and muffled, but I heard it clearly. "Put it on." My eyes went to the veil. The note had said I'd need it soon. Was this what they meant? My hand shook as I reached for it, the fabric colder than I remembered. I slipped it over my head, the thin black cloth pressing against my skin, dimming the world into a shadowed blur. The moment it covered my face, the knocking started again, but not at the front door. It was all around me. Walls, windows, floorboards. Soft, rhythmic knocks like 100 fingers drumming against the house. I backed into the living room, my heart racing, my breath loud in my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I pulled the veil from my face, the air in the room feeling heavier than before, as if it had been shared with too many people just moments ago. I went to the door again and looked outside. The street was empty. No shadows, no figures, no sound. Only the faint creak of the porch boards settling under their own weight. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it all, that it was just the stress of this place eating away at me. But when I turned to hang the veil back on its hook, I saw something that froze me in place. On the inside of the veil, just near the edge, there were fresh fingerprints. Small, narrow, pressed deep into the fabric, as if someone had been holding it from the other side. 2 nights after the knocking, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the grass outside my bedroom window. Slow, careful steps, the kind that weren't trying to sneak but also weren't in any hurry to announce themselves. My first thought was that it might be some local farmer passing through, but there was no reason for anyone to be in my yard at this hour, not unless they meant me harm or something worse. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The steps paused, then started again, moving toward the back of the house where the field stretched out into the darkness. That field had always unsettled me. Even in daylight it felt too still, too flat. The kind of place where you could watch something cross it for a long time before it reached you, but by then it might already be too late. Against my better judgment, I got out of bed and moved to the window. The moon was low, casting a silver glow over the field, and at first I didn't see anything. Then, far out where the grass met the tree line, I saw a figure. It was standing perfectly still, facing the house. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. It just stood there unmoving for what felt like forever. I thought about grabbing my flashlight, but some instinct told me that shining light on it might make things worse. Then, without warning, the figure began to walk toward me. Not fast, not slow, just steady, deliberate steps. My breath quickened. I backed away from the window, but I couldn't stop myself from looking back. Each time I glanced, the figure was closer. When it was halfway across the field, I realized something that sent a chill through my bones. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. They were moving, but the grass wasn't swaying. The figure reached the edge of my yard and stopped. It tilted its head slightly, like it was studying the house. Then, in one smooth motion, it lifted something into the air. My stomach twisted when I recognized it, the black veil. Even from this distance, I could see it hanging loosely from their hand, swaying in the night breeze. I didn't know how they'd gotten it. I'd left it hanging by the door inside the house. My mind scrambled for an answer that made sense, but nothing did. The figure didn't move for a long time. Then, just as it had appeared, it turned and walked back into the field, disappearing into the tree line without a sound. I stood frozen at the window until dawn, afraid that if I looked away I'd see them again, closer this time, maybe even at my door. In the morning I went to check the hook where the veil should have been. It was there, hanging neatly, as if it had never left. But now, along the edge, next to those small fingerprints, there was something else, a single strand of hair. Long, black and damp, as if it had been pulled from the earth. I didn't touch the strand of hair for a long time. It hung there, caught in the delicate lace of the veil like it belonged there, like it had been waiting for me to notice. The color was jet black, but there was something about the way it clung to the fabric that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just damp, it felt heavy, almost sticky, as if it carried something with it from wherever it came. Eventually, I slipped it into a small glass jar and sealed the lid tight. I don't know why I kept it, maybe because throwing it away felt like breaking some unspoken rule. That day, I walked into town, hoping for some kind of distraction. The streets were as quiet as ever, with only a few locals lingering outside the diner. When I passed, their conversation stopped. I pretended not to notice, but I could feel their eyes on me, following me until I was out of sight. At the small grocery store, I asked the cashier, a tired-looking woman named Beth, if she knew anything about veils or why someone might leave one at my door. She froze, her hand hovering over the register, and for a moment she wouldn't look at me. "You should go home before it gets dark," she said quietly, and that was the end of the conversation. On my way back, I took the long road that runs along the edge of the field behind my house. From there, I could see the spot where the figure had stood 2 nights ago. The grass was pressed down in a faint outline, like someone had been standing there for hours. I stopped, crouched down, and touched the earth. It was colder than it should have been, even for this time of year. That night I locked every door and window. I pulled the curtains tight, but even so I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around midnight I heard a faint rustling in the kitchen. My first thought was that it was a mouse or maybe the wind, but when I stepped into the room I saw the veil. It wasn't on the hook by the door anymore. It was lying flat on the kitchen table, and the jar with the strand of hair was sitting right in the center of it, open. The lid was placed neatly beside it, and the hair was gone. My pulse raced as I scanned the room, but nothing else seemed disturbed. I grabbed the veil and stuffed it into a drawer, slamming it shut, as if hiding it would make it stop. I sat at the table until dawn, the quiet pressing in on me like a weight. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside for air and froze. There on my porch was the strand of hair, tied into a small, perfect knot. I stared at the knot for what felt like hours. It wasn't just a casual tangle of hair. It had been tied with precision, tight and deliberate, like whoever did it wanted me to know it wasn't an accident. I didn't want to touch it, but leaving it there felt like inviting trouble, so I picked it up between two fingers. The strands were cold, unnaturally so, as if they had been lying in snow instead of on my wooden porch. I carried it inside and dropped it into the trash, but the second it left my hand, I felt a strange pull in my chest, like I'd just done something I wasn't supposed to. That day I tried to busy myself with chores, anything to keep my mind from circling back to the knot. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen as soon as the sun went down. Around 6 p.m., I heard a soft knock at the front door. Not the urgent pounding of someone in trouble, but 3 slow, deliberate taps. My first thought was to ignore it, but the knocking came again, the exact same rhythm. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. No one was there. But on the porch, right where the knot had been that morning, sat the glass jar. Inside was the hair again, the same strand, the same knot, only now it was sitting in a small puddle of water. I picked up the jar and realized the water was ice cold, so cold that the glass was slick with condensation. I set it on the counter and just stared at it, my mind screaming that I should throw it away, but something deep inside whispered that if I did, I'd regret it. That night, I dreamt I was standing in the field. The moon hung low and huge, painting everything in silver light, and in the distance, near the tree line, the figure was there again. But this time they weren't standing still. They were walking toward me, holding the jar in one hand and the veil in the other. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground, and every step they took brought the sound of running water, like a stream flowing somewhere far away. When they were close enough for me to see their face, I woke up, only to find the jar sitting on my nightstand, drops of water trailing down the side. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By dawn, I made up my mind to take the jar back into town, to Beth, to anyone who could explain what was happening. But when I opened the front door, I froze. The jar was gone, and in its place was a single wet footprint, facing into the house. The footprint was bare, perfectly formed. The toes and the arch pressed so clearly into the wood that I could almost feel the weight of the step that had left it, and the sheen of water around it had already begun to soak into the floorboards in a way that made my stomach knot. For a long time I didn't move, my eyes locked on it, my breath shallow, my body refusing to decide between fight or flight. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe I'd tracked it in myself somehow. Maybe a neighbor had come by, but the size was wrong. Too small for me. Too big for any of the kids I'd seen in town. And besides, I knew I'd locked the door before going to bed. Slowly, I forced myself to step back into the kitchen, every nerve in my body screaming at me to grab something, anything that could be used as a weapon. My hand found the old iron poker by the stove, its handle cool and slightly rough from years of use, and I gripped it so tight the metal bit into my palm. The silence in the house was suffocating. Not the quiet you get when you're alone, but the thick, oppressive kind that feels like someone else is holding their breath in the same room as you. I started moving through the rooms, one by one, careful to keep my back to the wall, checking behind doors, peering under tables, glancing into every shadowed corner, but nothing was out of place. The air felt heavier the farther I went, as if the whole house had shifted into a different state without me noticing. When I reached the hallway outside my bedroom, I saw another footprint, and another. A trail, faint but visible, each one just a little less wet than the last, leading down the hall toward the back door before vanishing completely halfway across the living room, like whoever had been there had simply stopped existing mid-step. My eyes followed the line to the far side of the room, and that's when I noticed it, the veil. It was draped neatly over the back of a chair I hadn't used in weeks, the lace pale in the dim light, swaying ever so slightly even though there was no breeze. The sight of it hit me like a punch because I knew exactly where it had been the last time I saw it locked away in the kitchen drawer. My throat tightened. I didn't want to touch it, but leaving it there felt worse, like it would keep moving closer on its own. I stepped forward, my free hand trembling as I reached out. The moment my fingers brushed the fabric, a sound sliced through the silence, a slow, deliberate inhale, close enough that I could almost feel the air shift against the back of my neck. I spun around, poker raised, but there was nothing there, just the same darkened corners and the faint creak of the house settling. My heart was pounding so hard it blurred my hearing, each beat echoing inside my skull. For a moment, I considered bolting out the front door, but some stubborn part of me wanted to know what was happening, even if it meant staying inside. I shoved the veil back into the drawer, slammed it shut, locked it, and backed out of the room without taking my eyes off that chair. That night, I didn't bother changing into sleep clothes. I lay in bed fully dressed, the poker leaning against the nightstand, my body rigid every time the house made a sound. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion must have pulled me under, because I woke to a faint, steady drip. At first, I thought it was the kitchen sink, but when I turned my head, my breath caught. The jar was back on my nightstand. It wasn't the same as before. The water inside was cloudy now, murky in the early morning light, and floating within it was the knot of hair. Only this time it had been untied, the strands drifting loosely like something alive. I leaned closer without meaning to, my eyes narrowing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, and that's when I realized there was something else in the jar. Something pale. Something small. My stomach flipped as I tilted the glass, and a fingernail floated up through the cloudy water, bumping softly against the inside with a faint, hollow tap that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. I froze, staring at it, and a terrible thought rooted itself in my mind. This wasn't just some object someone had left for me. This was a piece of someone. And whoever had put it here had done it while I was asleep, standing right next to me. The shed had always been an afterthought to me, a weather-beaten thing crouched at the far end of the property behind a tangle of overgrown grass and rust-colored weeds, its padlock thick with age and its windows fogged from decades of neglect. But after what I'd found in my bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected, that whatever was going on had threads leading all the way out there, pulling me toward it whether I wanted to follow or not. The morning was gray and damp, the kind of air that clung to your skin, and the smell of wet earth filled my lungs as I crossed the yard, each step slower than the last as the shape of the shed grew larger in my vision. The lock was cold when I touched it, unnaturally so, like it had been kept in ice. And as I leaned closer, I noticed something that made my chest tighten: faint scratches around the latch, tiny arcs carved into the metal as if someone had tried, again and again, to pry it open from the inside. My fingers hesitated on the keyring before finding the small, corroded key I'd seen in the kitchen drawer weeks ago, the one I'd never been curious enough to try. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed far too loud for the stillness of the yard, and the door creaked on its hinges as I pushed it inward, the smell hitting me first: damp, metallic, and faintly sweet in a way that made my stomach turn. The light through the fogged windows was weak, dust motes drifting in the stale air, and as my eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge from the gloom. Shelves lined with jars like the one I'd found in my bedroom, dozens of them, each holding cloudy water and something unidentifiable suspended within. My feet moved me forward before I realized it, my eyes scanning the rows until they landed on one jar near the center, its label smeared but still legible. My last name, scrawled in a hand I didn't recognize. The thing inside was impossible to make out clearly, pale and twisted, floating just beneath the surface. I reached for it, my hand trembling, but before my fingers could touch the glass, a sound rose behind me: slow, deliberate footsteps in the wet grass outside, coming closer, stopping just short of the doorway. I froze, my breath caught halfway in my chest, the poker from the house now feeling like a distant comfort I wished I'd brought. The silence stretched, heavy and unnatural, and then a shadow fell across the doorway, too tall to be any of the neighbors I'd met, too still to be casual. I stayed motionless, waiting for it to move, to speak, to do anything, but it didn't. The seconds dragged until my pulse was pounding in my ears, and then, without warning, the shadow shifted, and the faintest sound of the padlock clicking shut echoed from the doorframe. I lunged forward, but the door was already swinging closed, the strip of daylight narrowing to nothing as the latch caught. My hand slammed against the wood, the jars rattling on their shelves, but no answer came from outside. I spun back toward the rows of shelves, the jars now feeling closer, their contents swaying gently as if reacting to my panic, and my eyes kept returning to the one with my name. The water inside seemed darker now, almost red, and the thing within was rising toward the surface, turning slowly until I could see it clearly: a human ear, pale and bloated, the curve of it unmistakable. I stumbled back, knocking over another jar, its contents spilling across the floor, a wave of that sweet metallic stench filling the shed. My mind was a whirl of images: the footprint, the veil, the jar on my nightstand, and in that moment I realized something that rooted me to the spot. These weren't random, they were building towards something, a message I hadn't yet understood. Outside, the sound of footsteps started again, moving away this time, slow and steady, like whoever had been there wasn't in a hurry. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear more, but all that came was the faint creak of the house in the distance. And somewhere, the muffled sound of water dripping steadily into a container. The shed stayed locked behind me. The jar with my name on it burned into my memory like a brand I couldn't scrub away. But I didn't have the courage to go back for it. Not yet. Not when the air around the farm felt thicker than it had before, like the land itself was watching me. That night, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the old siding, and I sat at the kitchen table staring at the cold cup of coffee in my hands, wondering if I was imagining the low hum beneath the sound of the wind, a steady tone that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the fields. I told myself not to go, that I should stay inside, but the sound had a pull, an almost magnetic tug in my chest, and before I realized what I was doing, I had thrown on my boots and stepped out into the night. The moon was hidden behind heavy clouds, and my flashlight beam carved a narrow tunnel through the dark as I followed the noise past the barn and into the waist-high grass. The stalks whispered against my jeans, and the smell of damp earth rose with every step, stronger the closer I got to the far end of the property where the fence sagged under the weight of years. The hum grew clearer, and with it another sound, so faint I almost thought it was my own breath. A voice, low and deliberate, repeating something I couldn't yet make out. I stopped to listen, the hair on the back of my neck prickling, and realized with a jolt that the words weren't in English, but in some language I didn't recognize, syllables rolling like a chant. My light caught on something ahead, a scarecrow I'd never seen before, its clothes torn, head tilted at an unnatural angle. I moved closer, my boots sinking into the soft ground, and saw that its face wasn't a burlap sack at all but a cracked porcelain mask. Its painted smile split, revealing darkness behind. The voice was louder now, though the mask's mouth didn't move, and I could finally make out the rhythm of the chant, a pattern that repeated every 7 beats before pausing just long enough to make me lean in. Without warning, the grass around me rustled, not from the wind but from movement, something circling just beyond my flashlight's reach. My pulse quickened, the beam shaking in my hand, and I called out, my voice sounding too thin in the open air. No answer came, but the circling stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps moving away from me, back toward the house. I spun, the light slicing through the dark, but caught only glimpses, the edge of a coat, the flicker of pale fingers before it vanished into the night. The chant behind me stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was heavier than the words had been. I backed away from the scarecrow, my boots tangling in the grass, and kept the light trained on it until I reached the edge of the field. That's when I saw it. The porcelain mask was gone, the post stood bare, and in the grass where it had fallen was a folded piece of paper. I crouched, my hands shaking as I picked it up, the paper damp but the ink still sharp enough to read. It was a list, written in that same unfamiliar hand I'd seen on the jar label, the words in English this time, short and clipped. Rule 8. If you hear the field speak, do not answer. If you answer, you belong to it. I didn't remember answering, but the longer I stared at the note, the less certain I was, the edges of my memory blurring like fog rolling in. A sudden gust tore the paper from my hands, sending it tumbling into the dark, and I didn't follow, I ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly as I made for the porch. Inside, I slammed the door and locked it, pressing my back to the wood as if it could hold back the weight of the night. Somewhere out in the field, the hum started again, softer this time, almost patient, like it knew it could wait. The next morning came without sunlight, just a pale, muted gray that seeped through the thin curtains and made the kitchen feel smaller than usual, like the walls were leaning in. I didn't sleep, not really, more like dozed in short bursts, each one broken by the faint hum that still drifted in from the field as if it had followed me into my dreams. My coffee tasted like metal, and I kept catching myself staring at the back door, half expecting it to open on its own. That was when I decided I couldn't stay here any longer, whatever was happening in this town. Whatever these rules were meant to keep out or keep in, it wasn't my fight. I'd load the truck, drive until the gas ran out and never look back. But when I stepped outside with my first armful of boxes, the truck was gone. Not stolen, just gone, like it had never been there. The tire tracks in the dirt ended halfway down the driveway, cut off clean as if erased. My breath came short and I looked toward the road, but instead of the familiar fence line, I saw the field stretching further than it ever had, the grass swaying in a wind I couldn't feel. That was when I noticed the figure standing in the middle of it, still as stone, wearing the porcelain mask from the night before. My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to look away, back toward the shed, thinking maybe I could find something, anything, to defend myself. The door was ajar now, and the smell that drifted out was wrong, like damp soil mixed with rust. Inside, the shelves were bare except for one thing, the jar with my name on it, sitting in the center of the workbench. The liquid inside was darker than I remembered, almost black, and the label had changed. Instead of just my name, there were 2 words beneath it: Last Rule. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the glass cold against my skin. That's when I heard the creak of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, each one sinking into the dirt floor. I turned, but no one was there. The sound came again, this time from outside, moving toward the house. Heart pounding, I stepped out into the daylight, or what passed for it, and saw that the masked figure was gone from the field. In its place was a narrow path cut through the grass, leading straight to the porch. On the top step sat another folded note. I didn't want to read it, but my feet carried me forward anyway. The paper was damp like the last one, but the ink was bold, almost fresh. Rule 9. If you break a rule, the field will take you. Rule 10. You have already broken one. My mind raced, trying to remember every moment since I'd arrived, every rule I'd been told, every one I might have broken without realizing. The wind picked up, carrying the hum again, and this time it was closer, rising from beneath the porch as if the earth itself was singing. I backed away, the boards creaking under my weight, and almost dropped the jar when I felt the first vibration under my boots. The ground shifted, subtly at first, then more violently, the grass at the edge of the yard bending toward me like it was reaching. I ran, not toward the road, there was no road anymore, but toward the only place I thought might offer shelter, the old root cellar near the far fence line. My legs burned as I pushed through the grass, the hum chasing me now, louder, almost frantic. I reached the cellar door and yanked it open, the smell of damp earth rushing out to meet me. Inside was nothing but darkness, but it felt like a barrier, a place the field couldn't reach. I slammed the door shut and pressed my back against it, the jar clutched to my chest. For a while, there was only the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of wood settling above. Then, faint at first, a knock. Not on the door, but from inside the cellar, somewhere deeper in the dark. I froze, every muscle in my body taut, listening. Another knock, followed by a voice, low, calm, familiar, my own voice. It spoke the rules back to me one by one until it reached the last one. Rule 10. You have already broken one. The silence that followed was worse than the voice, thick and heavy in the dark. I don't remember deciding to move, but my feet carried me forward, deeper into the cellar, toward the sound. My fingers brushed against cold stone, then something softer, cloth. A hand closed around mine, warm and unyielding, and the jar slipped from my grasp, shattering against the floor. The last thing I remember before the dark swallowed everything was the hum, steady and patient, as if it had finally gotten what it came for.